Welcome to the Explainer. Today, we're doing something a little different. We are completely stripping away the noise of modern economics to look at the raw, absolute mechanics of human survival. And we're going to do it by following the journey of a very simple ancestor. Picture a blank white canvas. Throughout this explainer, we're going to watch a minimalist 2D stick figure evolve from a wandering scavenger into a highly structured, heavily taxed trader. It's an incredible story about how early humans actually earned their living. And, as you'll see, a lot of what we think we know about human progress, it's completely backward.
Okay, let's dive right into this. We're going to track four massive paradigm shifts: the forager's economy, the farming paradox, the myth of barter, and finally, state money and markets.
Section 1. The forager's economy. Let's look at early human survival. To really understand our ancient minimalist stickman, we have to throw out that whole stereotype of the primitive, bumbling caveman. Early foraging wasn't just aimless wandering around in the woods. It was a highly complex ecological strategy. Around 80,000 years ago, our stickman was mostly gathering fruits and eggs, and just kind of opportunistically scavenging whatever carcasses were left behind by other predators. But then, as the environment shifted between 80,000 and 70,000 years ago, human behavior changed dramatically. Our ancestors began crafting highly specialized tools, things like bone harpoons and intricate fishing nets, specifically to target large game and aquatic resources. You can actually trace how our stick figure moves from simple scavenging to spear hunting, netting fish, and eventually actively scattering seeds. This entire progression is driven by what anthropologists call the optimal foraging model. Basically, a forager only stops to handle a resource if the caloric payoff is higher than what they'd get by just continuing the search. And what's absolutely fascinating is that this optimization isn't just for adults. Anthropologists observing the modern Hadza people found that in safe environments with abundant resources, kids as young as 5 to 10 years old can actively forage and earn up to half of their daily calories. Our stickman wasn't carrying dead weight. Literally, the whole family could contribute to survival. Now, anthropologists generally divide these early economies into two distinct categories: immediate return and delayed return. Our immediate return stickman hunted and then consumed his food on the exact same day. Because there was zero storage, there was literally no way to accumulate wealth, which ensured the society remained fiercely egalitarian. But what if our stickman built a fish trap? That's a delayed return asset, and suddenly, everything changes. Once you have to sit there and guard a stationary asset for months at a time, you suddenly need leaders to arbitrate who gets what. And boom, social stratification begins.
And that beautifully illustrates why early humans lived in groups in the first place. Because foraging is incredibly risky. If an independent forager goes out hunting alone, they might face a 60% daily failure rate. That is a terrifyingly high chance of starving. But when 6 independent foragers pool their daily catches together, their mathematical probability of going entirely hungry on any given day drops to an incredible 4.7%. So sharing wasn't just humans being nice to each other, it was statistical survival.
But how did they actually enforce this sharing? Well, in highly stable groups, they used reciprocal altruism. I feed you today, you feed me tomorrow. But our early stick figures often lived in highly fluid, unstable camps where people were always coming and going. In those environments, they relied on what's called tolerated theft, or demand sharing. Think about it. If you killed a massive animal, the social and reputational cost of fighting off your hungry neighbors was just way higher than letting them take a piece. In fact, foragers actively avoided making binding long-term contracts with external traders, sometimes deliberately breaking promises, just so outsiders couldn't establish any economic leverage over them. Section 2. The farming paradox. The Neolithic Revolution. I'll let you in on a little secret. Almost everything we thought we knew about our stickman discovering farming is completely backward. The idyllic myth we're all taught is that farming was this glorious breakthrough that saved labor and brought instant prosperity. But the osteological reality, what the bones tell us, paints a vastly different picture. Skeletal remains prove that early farmers suffered a massive nutritional toll. They had higher rates of infectious disease, higher child mortality, and severe physical deformities. Their carbohydrate-heavy grain diets literally rotted their teeth out. On top of all that, farming required significantly more hours of grueling physical labor than hunting ever did, just to get the exact same amount of calories. So why on earth did our stickman trade his spear for a plow? To solve this paradox, we have to look at the Bowles-Choi model. Economists argue that our stickman didn't invent farming and then invent private property. Actually, scratch that, it was exactly the other way around. Private property had to exist first. Think about it. If our stickman spends 6 months growing a silo of grain in an open, foraging society governed by demand sharing, his neighbors are just going to come and eat it immediately. To protect that kind of long-term investment, the institution of mutually recognized private property rights, what we might call a bourgeois strategy, had to be established. Farming succeeded because it was much easier to define strict property boundaries around a stationary cow or a grain bin than a wild migrating deer. Section 3. The myth of barter, the origins of trade. Now let's move to the invention of trade, which is a topic where classical economics completely misread our history. You've probably heard the classic story from Adam Smith. Humans used to barter, swapping a chicken for a bag of salt. It was super awkward because you had to find someone who wanted exactly what you had, the famous double coincidence of wants. So naturally, we invented money to make it easier. What was money actually invented to solve this? The answer is a resounding, absolute no. Instead, our stickmen lived in a system often called everyday communism. Inside a village, goods and services were distributed based on informal, trust-based networks of mutual obligation. If you needed a stone tool to clear your field, your neighbor just gave it to you, with the implicit, unspoken understanding that you owed the community a favor later on. There was no exact mathematical exchange happening. Credit and debt existed thousands of years before physical money was ever minted. Pure barter was basically only ever used between hostile strangers, where absolutely no social trust existed. But when formal mathematical debt did eventually arrive, it was devastating. By 3500 BCE in Sumer, elite temples used clay tablets to aggressively track loans of grain and silver. And here's a wild detail. The Sumerian word for interest, mosh, was the exact same word they used for calves, because the concept of interest was modeled directly on the biological reproduction of livestock. When crop failures hit, our farming stickman simply couldn't pay these mathematically compounding debts. He was often forced to sell his own children into debt peonage. To prevent society from totally collapsing under the weight of this debt, Sumerian kings had to step in and issue massive, sweeping debt cancellations, the first royal jubilees, just to free the debt slaves and keep the state functional. Section 4. State money and markets. The rise of centralized economies. Now let's see how all of this snowballs into massive, centralized fiscal empires, where the state essentially took total control over our stick figures' labor. In Mesopotamia, the economy was dominated by the oikos, which was the massive corporate household of the temple. The state divided land into very strict categories: Nijena for the temple itself, Kura for the administrators, and Uridlau that was leased to independent farmers. If you were a dependent laborer working that Nijena land, you didn't earn a free market wage. No way. You were paid in a strictly centralized ration system. State scribes calculated your monthly allotments of barley, sesame oil, and beer based strictly on your age and gender. Unskilled women routinely received exactly half the rations of men. But what happens when that giant centralized ration state fails? Consider this dramatic microstory from Egypt in 1158 BCE. The state treasury was completely depleted and failed to deliver the monthly grain rations to the elite tomb builders. Led by a scribe named Amenacht, our stick figure artisans literally laid down their tools, marched to a mortuary temple, and staged a massive sit-in, shouting this exact quote, "We are hungry." It's one of the very first recorded labor strikes in human history, proving just how entirely dependent citizens had become on state redistribution for their survival. Now consider this incredibly tiny number, 0.14 grams. When those seat ration systems faltered, people had to rely on metallic exchange. Ancient Mesopotamian merchants crafted highly precise weights out of polished hematite, following a true Fibonacci sequence for small fractions. The smallest physical weight ever discovered from this era weighs just 0.14 grams. That's the equivalent of 1/60th of a shekel. The metrological precision required to weigh out 0.14 grams of silver scrap meant that these ancient markets were incredibly sophisticated, exacting, and highly structured. Across the world in China, the state took a completely different approach to currency. Before the empire, independent states traded with bronze money shaped like actual agricultural spades and scraping knives. But after unification in 221 BCE, Emperor Qin Shi Huang introduced the ban liang, a heavy bronze coin with a square hole in the middle. Subsequent emperors ruthlessly messed with this weight, though. When Empress Lu and Emperor Wen reduced the coin's mass, it triggered massive private counterfeiting. People started making paper-thin elm seed coins weighing barely 0.4 grams, which caused severe crippling inflation. It wasn't until Emperor Wu finally standardized the 5-zhou coin with a raised outer rim that imperial finances finally stabilized for the next 700 years. Taking a step back for a global snapshot, we see that early states demanded strict standardization to extract wealth, no matter where they were located. The Lydians stamped lion heads onto lumps of electrum, brilliantly shifting the value from the raw metal itself to the king's authority. African kingdoms used millions of uniform cowrie shells and intricately carved brass weights for gold dust. The Aztecs priced everything in strictly accounted bags of cacao beans, forcing conquered tropical provinces to literally pay their tribute in chocolate. Meanwhile, the Inca Empire ran an entirely moneyless system called the mita. This was a mandatory labor tax tracked flawlessly on knotted, color-coded cords called quipus. Just look at the journey our Stickman has made across this explainer. He went from a wandering, opportunistic forager avoiding any future obligations, to an agricultural peasant bound by private property, to a skilled laborer trapped in debt peonage, and finally, a taxpayer in a highly structured fiscal empire. Economic progress is clearly not just a straightforward, happy march of better and better technology. It is a series of massive institutional shifts specifically designed to manage environmental risk, coordinate human labor, and ultimately extract a surplus from the people at the bottom. We've seen that the transition to agriculture brought disease and much harder labor, and the invention of formalized credit often led straight to debt slavery. Our Stickman survived, yes, for sure, but at a tremendous cost to his personal freedom. It leaves us with a really profound question to consider. If the shift to complex economies brought such grueling hardship, did we build civilizations so that humanity could thrive, or did we build them simply to manage the massive, inescapable systems we became trapped in? Think about that next time you swipe your credit card. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and I'll catch you next time.